Hey people, about to replace the thermostat in this 3.2. This particular one is not allowing the engine to actually warm up enough, and even after a good hour or more of driving, the temperature is not even yet halfway. So this is a genuine Ford thermostat. It was actually cheaper than the aftermarket one, so go figure. So that we don't make too much of a mess, I'm going to drain most of the coolant out first. I'm going to reuse this coolant because it's actually fairly fresh. So we'll take that cap off and then we'll duck underneath the car. Okay, just underneath the front of the car here we have this front bash plate. We need to remove this just so we can get to the drainage point on the bottom of the radiator. There are 4 bolts, 2 at the back here and then 2 that sit right up underneath the plastic here. They're a bit harder to get to. They're a 15mm bolt. Just going to zip these out. Just left them loose for now, but they're still in place. Now the ones on the front are a little bit harder to get, like I said, because of this plastic here, but there's a fair bit of give in this, so I find that I can just flex it enough to get a ratchet up on there. So the front is just now sitting on here. And I'll remove the 2 bolts at the back. Now this guard can just push that guard up and out of the way. With that bash plate now removed, you can access up in here. Now this is the back of our radiator, and down in here, this is on the left-hand side, we have a drain valve. So I'm going to open this up and catch as much of this coolant as I can. Now I don't need to drain it all out, but I definitely want it lower than that thermostat level. But also by draining it out like this, it gives me an exact amount that I need to put back in as well. So it's a handy way of doing it. And like I said, it doesn't need to be drained out fully, but we just want to get enough out so that the level is below where that thermostat's going to sit. So we'll turn that off and head up back underneath the bonnet. Now just coming over to the thermostat here, this has 3 sort of screws holding it on. I'm going to leave the hose and everything in place, just take off as least as possible. Now this is a Torx bit, it's a T25. They're the screws that just hold the cover to the thermostat in place. Now, as this opens up, we still might get a little bit of coolant that drips through, but it's certainly not going to be much. Okay, so that's all 3 of the screws out. We should just be able to pop this apart. A little bit of coolant. And here is our old thermostat. Just pop it off. Just looking at it, it doesn't look as if there's any issues with it, but obviously it was opening too soon and allowing coolant to flow when it didn't need to. So we'll throw that one away. Actually, just before we do throw it away, it's pretty important just to double check that these things look exactly the same from new to old, and just make sure that it's going to be the right sort of fit. So you can see here they look pretty well exactly the same, but we'll throw that one away. Just check in here where it sits that there's no sort of dried coolant or anything, just preventing a good seal. Just make sure it's all tidy and clean in here. Same on that surface. Now, important note, when you put the new one in, this little jiggle valve, as they call it, needs to sit right at the very top. And this part sits into the engine. Won't fit in this way anyway, but don't even try. So we'll sit it in like this, that valve at the top. And there's a little groove that it all sits into. So it sits there something like that. Jiggle valve at the top. set that on there. Let's get these 3 screws in and get it all lined up. Just make sure that thermostat hasn't sort of fallen or slipped and sitting on an angle or anything as you begin to tighten them up. Just tighten these up evenly as you go. As you tighten them up, they feel like they get to a sort of like a positive stop, and then I just kind of nip them up a fraction from there. Okay, so I'm happy how that's all sat there back together. Now I'm recycling my coolant, so all the coolant that drained out, I'm now just going to put back in. Now I really didn't lose any coolant, so I know that all of this has to go back in. Now what you can see here is that this coolant bottle is now quite full, but this funnel is also quite full. And that's because we've got some air still trapped in this system. Now we're going to start it up, and I'm going to turn the heater on as well. Just let it run for a moment and we'll see that this coolant level begins to drop down. Whilst it's beginning to run, I'm just going to check initially for some leaks, but without the cap on, there's no real pressure in the system, so it's very unlikely if there was a potential leak that you'd even see it. After running a car for 30 seconds or so, the coolant level's about there in the funnel, and I can hear it gurgling away, so it's still drawing down more coolant. Because I knew how much I took out, it's very easy to know that all of this has got to go back in. I'll start the car up again and run it for a minute or two, and just see if I can purge that last bit of air out of the system. Make sure while you're doing that you run the heater, and you start to feel some heat coming through from that as well. With the engine running here, I can see a lot of bubbling and gurgling going on. My coolant level is nearly fully all the way down. So we'll give it another 30 seconds to a minute or so, and that'll begin to settle right down. After about a minute or so of idling, I can take this funnel away because the level has dropped down low enough. Okay, so I've just popped the cap back on. I can still see it's bubbling a little bit. So the air is going to rise to the top. These don't have a particular bleed valve. Look, in a perfect world, I'd probably vacuum fill this, but you know, we don't all live in a perfect world. So I'm just going to watch this level closely, just make sure that it settles. I'm also going to watch closely on my thermostat here that there's no leaks. But we'll take it for a drive and make sure it gets up to temperature. Before I take it for a drive, I do need to put that cover plate back in underneath as well. Okay, now, little word of warning with this. Because this engine never reached operating temperature, it never reached full pressure in the cooling system. So now that we've fixed this, it is potentially possible that that extra pressure may find a leak somewhere else in the system. Hopefully we're all good. I doubt we're going to have any problems, but I am going to thoroughly check all of the hoses and all the clips and clamps, etc., just when this is up to operating temperature to make sure that there's no leaks. The other thing you can do is always just do a pressure test and look for leaks that way. Hey, any comments, questions, concerns? Write them down below.